Now, those of us from a Western monotheistic, if not atheistic background, this idea of other gods is a little bit weird. But I want you to imagine yourself as an ancient Israelite. You've just come from living your whole life in Egypt, perhaps the most polytheistic society in the world. Everything was a god. In fact, there's a legend, probably apocryphal, but that when he was invading Egypt, the Persian king Cambyses II, at the Battle of Pelusium, this is one of my favorite stories, by the way, had his soldiers either paint cats on their shields or literally just throw cats at the Egyptian army. Holding cats sacred, the Egyptians essentially refused to fight, and so the Persians captured the city using cat missiles.
Drama has followed the Ten Commandments since the beginning. God Himself spoke from the top of Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning. The commandments are the only part of Scripture that God Himself physically wrote. Down through the ages, the commandments have been the benchmark of morality in Judeo-Christian thought, and today, the displaying of the commandments continues to be a source of controversy and drama. But what are the commandments? These 10 rules important enough for God to personally deliver. Join us on this 12-part journey through the commandments that form the bedrock for what following Christ looks like.
What if I told you that the first of the 10 Commandments does not, in fact, teach monotheism? Now that I've got your attention, let me assure you the Bible does teach monotheism, at least kind of, certainly in the prophets. The greatest commandment certainly highlights Yahweh's singular uniqueness, as we discussed in the first episode. On the other hand, the counsels of Yahweh that show up in the book of Kings and Job suggest maybe not? Either way, the wording of the first commandment is interesting. There will not be for you other gods opposite me or in my presence. The Septuagint, the Greek version, says only me. Some scholars have suggested that the wording implies the existence of other gods. Now, I think this is a little bit of a stretch, and the text isn't making a point on the existence of other gods one way or the other, but it doesn't deny it. Now, those of us from a Western monotheistic, if not atheistic background, this idea of other gods is a little bit weird. But I want you to imagine yourself as an ancient Israelite. You've just come from living your whole life in Egypt, perhaps the most polytheistic society in the world. Everything was a god. In fact, there's a legend, probably apocryphal, but that when he was invading Egypt, the Persian king Cambyses II, at the Battle of Pelusium, this is one of my favorite stories, by the way, had his soldiers either paint cats on their shields or literally just throw cats at the Egyptian army. Holding cats sacred, the Egyptians essentially refused to fight, and so the Persians captured the city using cat missiles. Again, this is probably apocryphal, although I deeply hope it's not. But it does give you an idea of the kind of world that the Israelites had just come from. One couldn't spit without hitting a temple, shrine, or sacred animal. And the first thing their new God says to them, which with him speaking directly to them is a wild concept in of itself, we won't get into here. But the first thing that Yahweh directly says to his people is, they are only to worship one God. Nobody worship just one God. Well, except for that Akhenaten lunatic, and Egypt had done everything in its power to pretend that he never existed. The thought of monolatry, the worship of a single deity, must have blown their minds. And as a spoiler for the rest of the Old Testament, they never really seemed to get the concept. But that's not a problem for us, right? After all, none of us worship other gods. I mean, I can't remember the last time I prayed to Ashur or offered incense to Zeus. We're not worshiping any other gods. At least I'm not. Or are we? Maybe the question of gods and worship is a little more complex than it appears. So to figure that out, let's dive in. You might have noticed that I used the term monolatry a moment ago, which is what the text is commanding here, as opposed to the term monotheism most of us are more familiar with. Monolatry means the worship of a single deity, which leaves open the possibility for the existence of other deities that one does not worship. Monotheism, on the other hand, is the belief in the existence of one singular deity and all others being fake, non-existent. Some sort, or at most, some sort of lesser beings, or maybe even the manifestations of that singular being in other contexts. The existence of other gods is not denied here, as we've mentioned, but rather the veneration of other gods is clearly prohibited, and that's the point of the commandment. Now, to be clear, the Bible does eventually get around to teaching some sort of monotheism. As the Shema makes clear, there is no other being on Yahweh's level. So any other god is at minimum a significantly lower version or lower level being. In Isaiah 37:19, Hezekiah comments that the gods Sennacherib boasts of overthrowing are not actually gods. Then there is the delightfully witty mocking of idol making in Isaiah chapter 41, verses 21 through 29, which is echoed in Jeremiah 10. And of course, in his letter, Paul repeatedly points out that pagan gods are essentially made up fairy tales or demons. Either way, they're not gods, and they're certainly not on the same level as our God, Yahweh, and his manifestation in Jesus. Yet this commandment does leave open the possibility on its own of other gods existing. In fact, so far as this commandment concerns, Yahweh doesn't really care if the Israelites believe in the existence of other gods. They just can't worship any of them or venerate them in any way, shape, or form. The phrasing makes that quite clear. The phrase upon my face, which I translate as like in my presence, eliminates them from adding gods as servants of Yahweh. So there's no Israelite pantheon, or more accurately, there's a pantheon of one. Similarly, a henotheistic god religion, which views all other gods as a manifestation of Yahweh, is right out. As the Shema says, it's Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So from a philosophical perspective, the Israelites were free to be polytheistic, at least metaphysically. In other words, they could believe that Horus or Marduk or Baal existed as entities, but they were to not under any circumstances worship them, or venerate them, or pray to them, or treat them as if they were real. Basically, they were to give any other gods they might believe in the existence of the silent treatment. And this is the key word here, worship. While being monotheistic helps in this regard, what really matters is our worship, our veneration, and our devotion. That belongs to Yahweh, Jesus in our case, and to Jesus Christ alone. So what does it matter? Why is this principle so important that it is literally the first words Yahweh speaks to his people? And while we're on this subject of asking questions, what is worship anyway? What are the consequences of worshiping other gods? So to answer this, let's take a step back and look at some of Yahweh's competition from the ancient Near East, in interpreting this through the lenses of obedience to Yahweh and the valuation of the other as being paramount. Remember, love God, that's obedience to Yahweh, and love our neighbor, the valuation of the other as being paramount. So we're going to dive into some mythology here. Before we do, I want to pause for a moment and add some disclaimers. Scholars are not exactly certain what the relationship between mythology and religious practice is. I hold the position that what we have preserved of the ancient gods in ancient Eastern mythology does reflect what people believed about the character of the deities they worshipped, and that those beliefs had consequences for how they interacted with each other and the world around them. I fail to see how they could not. But it should be noted here, there is some debate on this. So you may read something or listen to somebody else who has a different take on ancient mythology and its relationship to religion and practice and daily life. That's fine. There is debate on this, but I am presenting you from my perspective. The picture we have of what we do know of the gods the Israelites would have known is, in my view, rather disturbing. Let's start with creation and the nature of humanity. Simple subject to dive into, I know. In every creation story, human beings are an afterthought at best. From Mesopotamia, human beings were made to be chattel slaves. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the earliest creation and flood stories, human beings got their start because the gods, the lesser gods that is, went on strike and formed a union. This is true. This is what happened. So to avoid a total Lenin-style revolution, the chief god Enlil decides to create humans to do the menial labors of the minor gods so that they can just chill. If only the Tsar had thought of this. They kill one god, and from his blood and clay, they make human beings to work the fields, dig canals, and any other such menial task. I'm certain cleaning toilets was involved in there somewhere. Anyway, as time goes by, Enlil decides to just wipe all of humanity out. Not because they're violent or evil, but because they're too loud and they're messing his beauty sleep. Again, this is actually the story. I'm not really embellishing any of this. And so that's what happens. He sends a flood, he wipes out humanity, except for a few that are saved by one of the other gods, a god named Enki. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, tells a similar tale. This time it's Marduk, the patron god of Babylon and the head of the Babylonian pantheon, who creates human beings from the blood of a god and dirt for the same purpose, to do the manual labor for the gods. For what it's worth, the surviving Egyptian cosmogonies barely reference the creation of humans at all. Either people come from the tears or an egg, depending on which version you read. It's rather convoluted. Point is, in the Egyptian cosmogony, human beings are an afterthought. It's like, oh yeah, they're here too. Closer to home for the Israelites was Ugaritic mythology, a religion closely related to the Canaanites. One delightful character is Anat, probably my favorite character in all of mythology. But she's also a total psychopath. The embodiment of chaos and what happens when one lives outside the bounds of society. And no, it isn't a coincidence that she's a woman and a warrior. And there are definitely sexist undertones, if not overtones, in this story, in these stories about her. Regardless, our introduction to Anat is her massacre of an entire city for funsies, wading up to her waist in blood and laughing like a lunatic. And then, since that wasn't nearly enough killing, she invites warriors over to dinner and then slaughters them too. As an aside, when I first translated the story from Ugaritic, I couldn't understand the language well, and I initially thought that the story was she turned her furniture into warriors and then killed it, just because she needed to take her violence out. That's not actually a correct translation, but I kind of wish it was. Regardless, her hobby is just killing people for fun. Then there's the story of her as an antagonist in the Akkad epic, where she murders the prince Akkad because he won't give her his bow, and he also says some kind of mean things to her. Now, while Anat is clearly the antagonist in the story, she bears zero consequences for murdering Akkad because she's a goddess and she's untouchable. In ancient mythologies, might makes right. It's pretty that simple. Baal's kingship over the gods is earned by him fighting and killing Yam, the sea god and chaos god. Similarly, Marduk establishes his divine kingship by defeating Tiamat in the Babylonian creation myth the Enuma Elish already referenced, after a series of gods getting murdered. Perhaps the most disturbing pictures of the gods is in the Dunu Theogony from Sumer, which is a document that would make even Freud go, "Whoa, dude, chill." It is an Oedipus complex in story form, where mothers incite their sons to murder their fathers so the son could marry the mother. The mother then is murdered by the daughter, so who wants to marry the brother? And this over and over and over again. And this may be a satire or a critique of their gods, but this is a mythological story of creation that is horrific. This idea that rights are whatever you have the power to do is carried over into the ancient Near Eastern conception of kingship. For example, the Sumerian king list, which is exactly what it sounds like, makes the point that a city's sovereignty over the Sumer region was shown to be divinely appointed by victory in battle. Successful violence equals divine validation. Additionally, Hammurabi's law code, referenced in our last episode, reflects the same principle. It delineates punishment and human worth based on social standing. Those at the top, those with wealth and power, were treated with much greater leniency than those at the bottom of the ladder. Do the gods care about us? No, they do not. There is the story about Enki and a god or goddess, Ninmah, where Ninmah basically challenges Enki that there's a limit to what he can do. So Enki accepts the challenge, declaring that he can make good anything Ninmah does. So Ninmah creates all kinds of disabled people with blindness, deafness, physical deformity, mental illness, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, Enki, solely to prove how cool he is, and certainly not of any sense of compassion, gives them separate gifts as a counterbalance, such as giving a blind person talent for music. In all of this, these human beings are nothing more than the playthings for gods. Human disability and human suffering is simply the product of a divine drunken bet. Essentially, the gods showed that morality was based on what one could get away with, not on any sort of innate, fundamental right and wrong. And this bled into the social fabric of the societies that venerated them. The demands the gods put on their societies for worship was not right living, as we see Yahweh putting on his people. Again, we discussed this in our last episode. It was serving the gods hand and foot. It is no wonder then that we find these societies being aggressively expansionistic, conquering, enslaving, and murdering their way across the world in turn. People don't matter. Right and wrong don't really matter because the gods, frankly, don't really care. These gods were more than just powerful beings or fancy stories to these people. They were a system of belief that resulted in action. After all, action starts with what we believe about the world and reality. If you want to know what you really believe, do not start by saying what you believe. Observe what you do, especially when the chips are down. That reveals your actual beliefs. For the ancient world, who these gods were, what their existence said about the nature of reality, morality, and humanity, dictated the way their worshippers acted in the world. Let's consider the consequences of their creation stories. These stories are a far cry from the stories of Genesis 1 and 2, where humanity is the crown jewel of creation, endowed with royal status. We're going to talk more about that in the next episode. And human beings were tasked with maintaining, even creating, the world God had started. For everyone else, however, the purpose of humanity was simply to provide the gods with nice things as their slaves. The economies of Mesopotamia and Egypt were built fundamentally around temples. Fields were extensively irrigated to provide industrial levels of agriculture, not to feed the populace, but to feed the gods, and much of that work literally went up in smoke or rotted on the altars in front of the statues. Empire building was the order of the day, in large part driven by the need to acquire more and more resources to please the capricious deities who could and would abandon them on a whim. While all kingdoms operate with this mentality, the Assyrians were particularly notorious for this. They had a literal divine mandate to conquer the world, and the means weren't exactly restricted. Consequently, they were among the cruelest and most violent people in history. As horrified, rightly, as many of us are on both sides by the violence in the Israel-Gaza war, it is nothing compared to the nausea-inducing violence we read described by Assyrian monarchs in their never-ending conquests. They brag about burning children alive and painting the mountains red with blood, repeatedly. But when reading ancient history through this lens, is the rampant bloodshed, oppression, and xenophobia that I haven't even touched on any surprise? And what besides killing copious amounts of people and taking their stuff do these kings brag about? Building and furnishing the temples. What else would they brag about? Who cares about massacring, deporting, and enslaving people? They're only little humans. They're slaves to the god anyway. What happens to them doesn't matter. What matters is what you do for the god. So the more lavish temple you can build, the fancier temple you can build, that is what matters. The bones that you build that temple with don't. These systems of belief were fundamentally incompatible with Yahweh's system of belief. One could not incorporate Ashur or Ra or Baal or, heaven forbid, Zeus into Yahweh's picture of reality. They were the proverbial oil and water. Or perhaps more accurately, they were like sodium and water. And like sodium and water, mixing the two would blow up in your face. Nor could one incorporate these gods into some henotheistic religion with these gods being an extension of Yahweh. Ashur, with his violent, expansionistic ethos, could never be an aspect of Yahweh, nor could Anat, with her psychopathic mass murder, or Ishtar, with how she ran through lovers, ditching them for the newest shiny toy, often ditching them in the underworld, I might add. Those were characters who were fundamentally incompatible with who Yahweh is. They could not possibly represent him. Now, this is not to say that Yahweh does not commit violence himself, nor that the ancient Bible writers borrow language from neighboring mythology. Both are certainly true, but in radically different ways. Consider the flood story. In other flood stories, the flood was sent because humanity was too noisy, or in Gilgamesh, just because? I mean, there's no reason. Just like, yeah, we want to flood out humans and kill them all. And in both stories, it should be noted, the gods were not planning on anyone surviving. In fact, Enlil was furious at Enki, one of the other gods, that he had gone behind Enlil's back to save a family of humans. In essence, the gods destroyed humanity like one throws out an old toy that they're tired of. Yet in Genesis, while Yahweh also sends a destructive flood, it's because human beings were so evil that every thought was turned towards violence. Frankly, if that were true, the flood saved the world rather than destroying it. These are not the same thing, and they are not functionally compatible. It's one or the other. So no, other gods could not be accepted into the Israelite pantheon. Their pantheon was to be a pantheon of one, Yahweh. Now it should be noted, again, that the Israelites were horrible at keeping this commandment, bringing other gods left, right, and center, as many as they could and as fast as they could. Sometimes they were henotheistic, seeing Yahweh as manifestations of El, or Baal, or Asherah even, or as or having local versions of Yahweh. Sometimes they were straight polytheistic, even giving Yahweh a wife, which is a fun tidbit. In Judahite and Israelite sanctuaries, archaeologists have uncovered, such as the ones at Arad and Beersheba, there in fact are 2 places of honor in the holies of holies, not one, for Yahweh and somebody else, assuming his wife, probably Asherah. Unsurprisingly, there were negative consequences. Reading between the lines of the prophets, the disregard for humanity and the attempts at manipulating the deity through ritual, empire building, and so on, all crept into Israelite society. Again, go back and listen to the last episode for some of the lengthier quotations from Isaiah and Amos and Micah and Hosea. And as they crept, and by which I mean blew the door down and took over, they tried to meld these incompatible belief systems and twisted the religion of Yahweh from the self-sacrificing, other-centric religion into one of greed and violence, reflecting the religions around them. Violence, infidelity, oppression, and xenophobia became the order of the day in Israelite society. Something Yahweh railed against constantly through his prophets. And yet, it even got to the point that Yahweh told them to not even bother with following the rituals he himself had prescribed because they had so completely misunderstood and abused them. He just wanted to be done with the whole thing. When it came to following Yahweh, it was either you worship him exclusively or you don't bother worshiping him at all. There was no both and. Hence, no other gods. Period. Now, by now, the real issue ought to be clear. It wasn't so much about the names or even the religious practices themselves, many of which overlapped with the Israelites. They shared a lot of the same practices, sacrificing animals, for example, or conducting divination, forms of divination, as their neighbors. It's what these gods represented and what the consequences of worshiping them would result in. The beliefs about the world and each other that would result from venerating these gods, which in turn would drive action, was destructive and incompatible with Yahweh's call. Gods, then, were not simply mythical beings of supernatural power. Gods were institutions, doctrines, systems of belief, and individuals that we venerate as guiding lights, as authoritative in our life. And there is only room for one such figure. For us today, that person is Jesus Christ. When we think of it like that, the first commandment suddenly becomes a lot more relevant. We could go on and on for hours about different gods in our lives. Just about any institution could be considered a god, one that brings us perilously close to breaking this commandment, if not taking us over the line. Even Christianity itself, certainly institutionalized Christianity, and by extension the denominations therein, can become a god rivaling Christ. The dangers of these gods become frighteningly apparent when we view this commandment through our 2 lenses. The first lens, of course, being the Shema, straightforward. Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. Therefore, we love him alone. Before anything else, to be a Christ follower, we must accept the premise that A, Christ is singularly unique in the universe, and consequently, Christ alone is worthy of our veneration as suzerain in our lives. As for the second lens, We see in the history of Israel and its accompanying oppression the hatred of the neighbor and the vulnerable. It seems particularly appropriate to discuss politics and religion given the election we are heading to in this country. American Christianity has become so ingrained in us that it's hard to tell where America ends and Christianity begins and vice versa. It also illustrates that keeping this commandment is harder than it may appear, because to truly follow this commandment forces us to make very difficult choices. Let us take one of the hot button issues in this cycle: immigration. Specifically, immigration on the southern border. We don't really talk about that much about Canadians coming down. While Democrats and Republicans have different attitudes towards migration, both agree that migration coming from the South is a functional problem to the United States. And indeed, they are right. It is a problem for America as a society and an institution. Some immigration is good and healthy for society, but immigration on the scale that we are seeing is inherently destructive for a number of reasons. As we've already seen, the U.S. fundamentally lacks the infrastructure and resources, vast as ours may be, to process and integrate immigrants en masse into our society. Cities like New York and Chicago, where I live, that have welcomed immigrants with open arms just a year ago, are now literally turning them out into the streets because they simply do not have the resources to cope with the vast amounts of unworking people that are living in limbo. The resources and infrastructure just aren't there. And the cost of investing in those resources would ultimately be damaging to other necessary services. They also have to pay teachers and road workers and public works in the whole 9 yards. Consequently, there are millions of immigrants who simply just don't have jobs, homes, don't know the language, or even have the rights and have no place to go. Crime and unrest are natural consequences of this, although to be clear, we have not seen rises in crime due to migration here. Migrants are not committing crime at higher levels than the rest of society, despite what some people might say. However, in the country of Sweden, whose open-door immigration policy has recently been reversed, they have seen a staggering rise in gang and teen violence as the immigrant portion of their population has reached around 20%. Again, we're nowhere near that percentage in America, but we do see that there is an inherent rise in crime when immigrant populations start reaching those percentages. Such an influx of immigration naturally is going to create a change in value as the population demographic changes. Another reason Sweden has failed to remain the beacon of a welfare state working so well. For such a system like Sweden's to work, there has to be a total buy-in from the people, a certain attitude towards wealth and community. They call it janteloven. When the demographic changes, however, so does the value system. And when the value system changes, the ability to sustain a state based on that value system ultimately begins to fall apart. It has to. If migrants keep coming to the U.S. in the numbers that they do, we face a similar dissolution of American values that this country has been founded and worked on. Historically, one factor, among many, to be sure, of societal collapse is massive demographic shifts, often through immigration. One of the main reasons for the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire, for example. And it was likely a major contributor to the collapse of the late Bronze Age empires in the ancient Near East around the time of Moses, a little bit after him. So from an American perspective, we ought to support a policy that severely restricts immigration. It is what is inherent in the best interest for our society and American institutions. But what about from a Christ follower perspective? When we read the Torah, such as the passage on the second greatest commandment that we talked about last episode, over and over again, Yahweh commands the Israelites to defend, protect, even prioritize the migrant. Now, some translations may use the term sojourner or alien, but the best translation for the word ger, the Hebrew word ger, is migrant, the same as the people coming up from the southern border. The prophets roundly condemned the Israelite nobility for their impression of migrants, for their refusal to open up their homes and their land to them. The entire book of Ruth is a commentary on the importance to Yahweh of welcoming in the migrant, including, if not especially, migrants that people would find distasteful, like Ruth the Moabite. Well, the New Testament world of the Roman Empire had different challenges for Christians, who were often migrants themselves. Jesus' description of his followers at the end of all things in Matthew 25 are those who prioritize the care and well-being of migrants. Peter's experience with Cornelius and Paul's instruction, and particularly in the books of Romans and Galatians, emphasize the necessity for an opening up and welcoming of non-Jews into what was initially a sect of Judaism. This is a form of migration and welcoming in migrants wholesale. Indeed, Jesus makes it clear this is the expectation. So as we approach the election on the question of immigration, we see how the first commandment applies to our lives. There is a clear contradiction in our priorities. On the one hand, as Americans, we have a duty to prioritize American interests, which means being restrictive with support for migrants. But as a Christ follower, we have a duty to prioritize the well-being of migrants, even at the expense of ourselves and even at the expense of American society as we currently understand and know it. The first commandment makes our response crystal clear. American interests are of no concern to us. To borrow from New Testament parlance, we are citizens of a different kingdom, one not of this world. If we find ourselves concerned with American interests and then see that that concern supersedes loving our neighbor, specifically defined as the migrant, well then, we have another God before Christ. This is one example, but the list of things that can become gods before Christ rivals any polytheistic pantheon ever made. Any institution, doctrine, government, philosophy, anything that commands authority in our lives, that becomes a god before Christ. We've already seen how country can become a god, but so can something good like institutional Christianity. This episode has gone on long enough, so I won't go into too deep into the long and sordid history of institutional Christianity. But it isn't pretty. Just look the massacre of the Saxon pagans, to the Crusades, to the forced conversions of indigenous populations, to the cover-ups of sexual abuses that have only recently come to light. The list is long. When the institution becomes more important than the people, even the Seventh-day Adventist Church can become a god. This doesn't mean we can't work with or learn from other institutions or systems of belief. Institutions have practical value. God himself created institutions, such as Israel or the church. And scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, tends to borrow heavily from other religions and cultures, from imagery to structure to even some ideas. But at no point is there a veneration of any of these to where Christ stands. He is always supreme, and any other must bow to him or be discarded completely. So, the question for you is, what are your gods? Who is your God? And where is Christ in your pantheon?